The problem is the certification. It is a money-making industry.
What it needs is
We
government
shouldn't be
regulation.
allowed to question where the money
Quite
goes
clearly,
and what it
Halal
is.
certification to find fighters
There
in
needs to be
Syria.
clear
Quite clearly,
labelling.
Halal certification in charity.
A federal government inquiry was launched on halal certification after public outrage sparked by Kirralie Smith. Dubbed the accidental activist, Kirralie is your everyday Australian woman, wife and mother who stumbled across some concerning facts and decided to do something about it.
In the end of 99-2000, my husband Greg and I decided to do a trip overseas. We spent a month in Mali in northwest Africa, seeing how Islam impacts the society and how dangerous it is, how difficult it is for women and for minority groups has been just so incredibly helpful in our journey. We had the opportunity in 2002 to go to Indonesia. It was just staggering, the numbers, tens of thousands of people displaced and 10,000 or so people murdered, and we had heard nothing about it on the news. That was an incredibly devastating experience. We came home and I just felt lost. I didn't know what to do. In 2010, in my hometown, there was a conference on Islam, and the speaker at that conference was phenomenal. But one comment that he made through that conference was that he didn't buy halal certified products as he wasn't sure where the money ended up, and there was a suspicion that it could be funding extremism. That caught my attention, and I went home that night actually and started Googling halal certified foods. I couldn't find accurate information about this. There was bits and pieces of information, but there actually wasn't any clear list. It was very hard to find out what was and what wasn't halal certified. And I realised very early on, there's something wrong here. And over the next 10 months, I did a lot of research. I contacted over 500 companies and found that there is in fact a lot of bribery, corruption, and misinformation about halal certifications. I launched HalalChoices and we did not publicise it, we did not promote it at all, and in a very short space of time we had over 100,000 unique visitors a month to this website. It clearly is an issue that a lot of consumers want information about. After we launched the website, most of the feedback was really positive, but within a few months I got some people being very angry in what I'd been exposing. But during that time I went to a conference and I met some representatives of the Assyrian community. That was one of the most significant turning points of my life. Their relatives, some of them themselves, have had to flee Syria, and it was so hard to accept that this was actually happening in the world.
You see a lot of Christians fleeing the country because churches are bombed, schools are bombed. If you are a Christian, you have no place here. So it's either convert to become a Muslim, or that's your life gone.
They very sincerely took hold of my hands and said, please don't give up. Please don't stop what you're doing. It's very important that you continue to share your message about how destructive Islam can be to people. It's very important that people hear the truth. And I think that we all need to have this conversation. We need to address that halal certification is fine. If Muslims want to fund it, that is their choice. But there is no way that that should be imposed upon or funded by the majority of consumers in this country. After years of researching and sharing my findings with consumers and companies, as well as countless emails, phone calls and visits to politicians, the Senate finally agreed to hold an inquiry into third-party certification of food in 2015. Senator Cory Bernardi was able to get the inquiry approved. It ran for over 6 months, received an almost record number of submissions, about 1,500, and included 3 days of hearings. As the inquiry unfolded, it became increasingly clear through the submissions and hearings that my concerns were valid and important. Issues of corruption, fraud, profiteering and monopolies became increasingly evident.
It struck me as odd that a tiny percentage of the country are making financial demands of Australian companies to further their own cause. The more I dug, the more concerned I was, and yet no one in the government seemed to want to pay any attention to it. The abuse that came my way from sections of the media, sections of the government, and sections of the public for even talking about it demonstrated to me how distorted public debate can be. So I was fortunate enough to get a broad-ranging inquiry up into certification to see whether the halal certification was similar to the kosher certification, to the organic certification, any other certification that takes place. And what we discovered is even more alarming than I thought.
To date, the government has refused to implement these recommendations despite the bipartisan agreement that they should be accepted. These changes will benefit consumers, companies and meat exporters in this country. It's completely unacceptable that the Australian government has either ignored or rejected these practical steps that would benefit all Australians. The halal industry needs to accept clearer labelling to allow consumers to make informed decisions regarding their grocery purchases, and it must become a user-pays system, and all forms of discrimination must be removed. In Australia, there are many different kinds of certifications that companies can pay for. In nearly all cases, it is a deliberate part of their marketing strategy to target a particular group of consumers. For example, organic certification is for the healthy and environmentally conscious consumer. Kosher is for the Jewish consumer. In nearly all cases, the certification is clearly marked. These certifications are not hidden, nor are they profiting from the wider market who do not want to pay more for these certifications. The curious thing is that halal certified products are not usually clearly marked on labels. In fact, the certification is often hidden or very difficult to find. How does the consumer, either Muslim or non-Muslim, know that this product is suitable? Where's the choice? Why is it hidden? Why are non-Muslim consumers subject to these certifications?
You know, you have some religions, some branches of Christianity, of perhaps Judaism, certainly of the Sikhs, where actually if something has been through a halal ritual slaughter, they're simply not allowed to partake in that. So clear labelling is important. The next item you buy, have a look, see if it's halal certified.
What needs to happen is the government needs to act. It needs to enforce strong labelling requirements, remove the profiteering from halal certification, and groups that want particular food produced a particular way should pay for that themselves.
I value and believe in the democratic and free society we enjoy in Australia. I value and believe in freedom of religion. I have a problem though when one religion or religious practice is imposed upon me and leaves me with little or no choice. It is my assertion that halal certification practices are in fact imposed upon me and our society, often without consumer knowledge or consent. Many people who speak out against halal certification are labelled as bigots or racists. I have never heard someone who criticises the Catholic Church labelled a racist or a bigot. Speaking out against communism is not seen as an attack on Chinese or North Korean people. You would certainly be seen as an idiot to call anti-communism racism, and yet anyone who wants to discuss the religious political ideology known as Islam is shouted down with ridiculous name-calling. Why is Islam as a subject untouchable and off-limits? This kind of behaviour is not conducive to consumer confidence. It is simply rude, arrogant and dismissive of genuine concerns. Imagine if it were discovered tomorrow that a Christian church or leader had been growing rich from a certification scheme on products. Imagine if it were discovered they went around to companies charging fees for inspections to make it permissible. Imagine if they started calling their detractors racists and bigots because they objected to this fee. Can you imagine the media criticising and mocking anyone who objected to a Christian leader becoming a millionaire from such practices? That would never happen, nor should it. There would be outrage expressed all over the country. It sounds ridiculous, but that is exactly what is happening with halal certification. No one in Australia would tolerate such a scheme if it were perpetuated by right-wing, fundamental Christians, and yet we seem to live in this politically correct bubble which makes it taboo to criticise Islam, but you can criticise just about anything else. And because we demand a choice and transparency in this industry, we are called racists and bigots.
If your argument for halal certification is, to be all warm and fuzzy when it comes to cultural understanding, you would also want clear labelling for those other people that are in cultures where they can't actually partake in something that's gone through a halal ritual slaughter.
The other thing the Australian consumer needs to know about is whether money from their purchase will fund a religious organisation, whether it be Islamic, Hindu, Jewish or Christian. So they can make a choice about whether they want their money to go to that organisation.
Look, halal certification concerns a lot of people, and people just don't want to be forced to pay for a product where part of the money is going off to a religious organisation to basically fund elements of the propagation of that religion. And I can clearly understand that.
We are an overall multicultural country, and that's what's beautiful about Australia. But at the same time, specific groups should not be strictly imposing certain things or certain laws that come from different countries onto the people that are here.
Many companies have paid halal fees despite their products already being permissible for Muslims to consume. The requirements for a product to be halal or permissible basically means no pork, alcohol or carrion. Most people can read the labels to determine whether or not a product is suitable. As a result of education, market response and consumer pressure, quite a few companies have now reconsidered paying halal fees on products that are already considered halal.
Well, firstly, I think domestically it's entirely unnecessary. I mean, we have, maybe less than 2% of the population are Muslim or identify as Muslim. Most of them are not observant Muslims, and yet suddenly we're certifying water, all our livestock, our food produce. It's entirely unnecessary, it's expensive, and I think it's a scam, and that's been proven by the evidence in the Senate committee inquiry.
Many halal certifiers disagree about what constitutes halal. A lot of the organisations say on their websites that products such as honey, milk, nuts, grains, fish are all naturally halal. That is, no fees are required. Why is it these companies are paying money to state the obvious and then not disclosing it to the consumer? Why are some companies lying about halal certification?
There are a whole bunch of grubs in this industry who are crooks. And that's why I have no shame or compunction in saying the industry itself is corrupt and it needs to be redeemed. If it is in our national interest to have our export markets available, or these export markets available to us, well, let's clean it up. Let's stop the rorts and let's stop certification in Australia on the widespread scale that it currently is.
There is a large level of concern within the community about halal certification.
There are many examples of how pervasive halal practices have become in Australia. In many cases, they are unnecessary and not even predominantly for the Muslim market. This is just one example from the chicken industry. There are plenty more like it.
5% of chicken processing is exported, yet most is for domestic consumption. More than 70% of chicken processed in Australia is halal certified. Less than 5% of this is exported, primarily to non-Muslim markets. So why are these companies paying around $40,000 a year to be halal certified? Why is it that around 6 to 7 Muslim-only, male-only halal slaughterers are employed to pray and observe on site?
Most slaughtering is done by machine, and the Muslim-only, male-only employee is there for an Islamic religious ritual which is totally irrelevant to most Australians. Do you really accept that those wages and certification fees are absorbed by the chicken processor and not passed on to the consumer? Usually at this point, the naysayers like to jump on the "it's for export" bandwagon. Well, chicken.org.au reports the following.
This means that virtually all chicken meat eaten in Australia is grown in Australia. Also, almost all chicken meat produced in Australia is consumed locally, with just under 5% being exported. Australian chicken meat is exported primarily to South Africa, the Philippines, Hong Kong, Singapore, and the South Pacific Islands.
These are not even primarily Muslim countries. The extent of halal certified products has clearly gone way beyond what both Muslim and non-Muslim consumers would deem necessary.
Look, governments do have competing interests, and there's only half a dozen of the serious meat exporters or so, and they probably pack less clout than the hundreds of thousands of Muslim voters and some of the foreign countries that they want to maintain diplomatic ties to.
We have seen through the inquiry process that 95% of chicken meat in Australia is sacrificed to Allah, even though there is no export market for chicken in Australia.
But the real rorts are going on domestically. There is no need for a halal certification industry like we've got in this country. And you can compare it, and we did compare it with the kosher certification, which is run not for profit. It's tailor-made, and the cost is inevitably borne by the small section of the community that look for that product. We look for the organic certification, which is credible, and people are opting into that. But there's no way of effectively opting out of this halal certification. Companies hide it. They won't disclose how much it's paid. All the evidence is it's coercive. And if you go to an abattoir, you don't see too many non-Muslim women working there, because it's a closed shop, and this is thuggery of the highest order. It is something we wouldn't accept from any union, but why are we accepting it from the Union of Halal Certifiers?
I have been lobbied by the meat industry around those Senate recommendations. The meat industry do want to see the Senate recommendations regarding export markets resolved. In fact, what they think would be the best practice in some respects would be to have a system whereby if something is for an export halal market, that's the stuff that's actually certified, and they pay for that, and the meat that's for the domestic market, they don't have to pay for it.
It is very difficult to determine the actual cost of halal certification in Australia. There is a great deal of secrecy. Most of the companies asked say it's against their policy or against their contracts to disclose the amount of halal certification. Despite this, we discovered there is a very large price range when it comes to halal certification.
We know a chicken delivery van had to pay several hundreds per year, even though there was no difference to his van whether he paid the fees or not. He was merely transporting the chicken which he had picked up from a halal certified factory. Factories pay tens of thousands a year plus 3 cents per sticker, and that was a couple of years ago. A2 Milk told us that they were quoted around $7,000 per year. They didn't go through with it. Copico told us that they were charged $1,500 a year to have one product halal certified. A confectionery supplier said that they were quoted $1,375 but didn't go with it as they were not manufacturing or retailing the product and it seemed unnecessary. Others, like Florio, have stated in the media they pay around $1,000 a year despite the fact their products are halal anyway. It is interesting to note that in some federal court documents that are available, the cost of halal certification is much higher. It says the ordinary license fee for chicken kebab retailers was $5,000 per annum. The license fee for wholesalers, such as Quality Kebabs, without GST, was $27,090 in 2012, $33,580 in 2013, and $34,510 in 2014. We also know some abattoirs in Queensland are having to fork out up to $27,000 per month for halal certification. Money which is allegedly being used to fund Islamic schools and mosques, according to reports in several media outlets.
No matter what evidence is presented to the contrary, there are none so blind as those who will not see, and there are plenty of blind people when it comes to what's happening with funds from halal and how it's been misused internationally against Western interests.
Government regulation should be capping the price of halal certification to ensure that it is simply cost recovery, maybe an ordinary wage for the people involved who are doing the certification, but that's about it. I mean, massive profits above cost of recovery and taking an average living wage, you've got to start questioning why they're doing that, and well, the answer we know is to propagate their religion. Now, there's a very big question around the ethics of that.
It's vital that people understand the link between halal certification and Islamisation. It is why we've made this documentary.
Mosques and Islamic schools teach the Quran. It's not illegal to teach the Quran in Australia. However, many Australians are not in agreement with what is taught in this book. Inequality of women, homosexuals and minority groups is taught in Australian mosques funded by the profits of Halal Certification. So why should non-Muslim Australian consumers contribute towards such practices?
Islam is divisive and is anathema to everything that we stand for, including our democracy.
What is Sharia? Sharia means the way or path. Islamic Sharia refers to the whole system of principles and rules which a Muslim is required to live by. It relates to both criminal and civil justice, and it also regulates personal and moral conduct. Sharia goes way beyond food and halal, but the point we want to make is the desire for Sharia to be accepted as a part of our mainstream society. So the money that is paid out in fees for halal certification is used to fund in part or whole Sharia in Australia. For example, the Supreme Islamic Council of Halal Meat in Australia are a registered charity earning more than $1 million a year. Their purpose is stated on their website as advancing religion. How do they fund it? Primarily through the shopping purchases of non-Muslim consumers. No informed consent has been given by the majority of consumers, and there is a great need for this information to be present on the labels. The Islamic Council also refers to Sharia on their website. Islam is not a mere religion. It is a way of life with rules and manners governing every facet of life. Since food is an important part of daily life, food laws carry a special significance. An Islamic leader quoted as saying, "Let's dominate the world through halal." This is another example that halal and Sharia go hand in hand. Without Sharia, there is no such thing as halal.
As a former nurse, I care about the treatment of women and children. And last year alone, the Australian Federal Police investigated 69 cases of forced underage marriage, some as young as 9. Now, that is not acceptable. And it's estimated that in this country, close to 83,000 women have been subjected to female genital mutilation. We're also recognising polygamous marriage under Section 6 of the Family Law Act. Provided the marriage is carried out overseas, we recognise polygamous marriage. All of these things are part of Islam and Sharia, and it's not acceptable.
The Islamic Council of Victoria actually advocated to a parliamentary inquiry as to why Sharia law should come into Australia and we should accept it when it comes to family law. Now, I can't think of a worse outcome, quite frankly, having Sharia law, a law that puts women on a very different level to men, that is sexist, being part of our family law system. Without a doubt, what we can say is that there's clear discrimination, and in Australia, we would say that men and women are on equal footing.
Q Society is a human rights organisation. We are concerned about the impact of Islamic Sharia on our society. Discussing Islam is not about denigrating Muslims or hating anyone, and it's not a right or a left-wing issue. It is a human rights issue.
Do your own research. Go there. There are plenty of sites. There are plenty of Islamic sites that are available that will provide you information about halal certification, that will provide you information about Sharia law. Go and actually have a look at the Islamic websites that promote the proper understanding of Sharia law, and you will be surprised to find how wide Sharia law goes. From the criminal regulations such as death for apostasy, all the way through to how a husband should treat or mistreat his wife, all the way through to how a person should wash their hands. The last thing we want is a system that brings Islamic law into Australia, imposes it on our food and spreads from there.
In the USA, Canada and France, there have been proven links between halal certification organisations, Islamic charities and terrorist organisations. It is reasonable that these links are thoroughly investigated here in Australia. In Australia, the government issued this report from the Australian Institute of Criminology in 2011 titled Money Laundering and Terrorism Financing, Risks to Australian Non-Profit Organisations. It is concerning that charities in particular are thought to provide terrorists with the ideal vehicle with which to both generate support for their activities and propagate their particular ideologies. The report also states,
there exists many examples of organisations which, in addition to their violent activities, devote significant time and resources to take care of the poor in a more or less institutionalised way. So-called asset substitution, where funds are interchanged between legitimate and illegitimate uses, is seen as a particular issue and is carried out by groups such as Hamas, Hezbollah and the LTTE. These groups are recognised as sponsoring a combination of humanitarian and terrorist activities.
Some of the Islamic charities that receive halal certification funds, or some of the organisations in Australia that receive halal certification funds, then go on and support Islamic movements or organisations internationally that do have links to groups like Hamas or Hezbollah, or are supporting agendas that are against the national interest. Now, one of those I think is HAI, Human Appeal International, and they've been linked to those sorts of outfits, and yet we have Islamic halal certifiers in this country proudly talking about the money they give them.
AUSTRAC lists financial contributions through formal charitable donations as one of the 3 most common methods by which terrorism funds are raised in Australia. More recently, AUSTRAC published this report, Terror Financing Australia 2014. The report says,
some Australia-based charities and NPOs have been exploited by terrorist groups to raise relatively large amounts of money over time. These organisations can be exploited in a number of ways. Charities and NPOs can be used to disguise international funds transfers to high-risk regions. Funds raised for overseas humanitarian aid can be commingled with funds raised specifically to finance terrorism. Funds sent overseas by charities with legitimate intentions can also be intercepted when they reach their destination country and siphoned off for use by terrorist groups.
The government really does have an obligation to step in and make sure that it's regulated appropriately.
It seems that AUSTRAC knows for certain that charities and NPOs have been used to fund terrorism, and yet there is no disclosure, charges have not been laid, and one could presume they are still operating. Perhaps if organisations and individuals were not able to profiteer from halal certification, the risks of funding terrorism would be decreased. We know in the USA, France and Canada, this is exactly how extremist groups have been funded. It really must be noted that many Muslims also speak out against the current use of halal fees and practices. An imam from South Africa delivered a comprehensive sermon about it a few years ago. He said,
halal stamps have knowingly been granted to products later found to not be halal at all. And it is happening here, with the desire for profit getting in the way of common sense, and stamps being sold to be affixed on products such as water, toothpicks and black pepper. This is a clear misuse of the system.
We've seen evidence in Indonesia. I believe the Umar Council there, all of the imams and sheikhs that determine what's halal and what's not, they raised questions about one Australian certification company, and if you dig deep on the net you'll find many other cases overseas where certification companies right across the world, not just in Australia, have been called into question. One of them actually was done for putting pork meat in a product in Europe, and you would think that for the integrity of the halal system themselves, they want it regulated to stop dodgy operators like that.
The Sydney Morning Herald have published articles about the very concerning fact that AFIC and many Islamic councils control millions of dollars in halal certification fees. The money is also a vital subsidy to the new Islamic schools flourishing in Australia. Islamic individuals and groups have said themselves that the halal fees could end up funding Islamic extremists. The government has a responsibility to ensure that allegations of corruption are investigated. Predominantly Islamic countries, such as Indonesia, Malaysia, Turkey and Saudi Arabia, have one main halal certification body. Australia has at least 33 halal certifiers, which are formed into 2 main groups. The first is the Islamic Incorporated Associations, of which there are 15 certifiers, and the second are private companies or businesses, of which there are 18 certifiers.
Really, why do we need so many different certifications? And what you find though, and this is where the problem does come into play, is that Malaysia might have one requirement that Saudi Arabia doesn't, that Iran doesn't, that Iraq does. There's got to be careful working with each of these export markets to ensure that whatever process that we put in place satisfies that market. But you could whittle it down to probably 4 or 5, regulate it to stop them from price gouging, because I've got to say I think there is a lot of that goes on, and that's certainly the complaints that come from the meat industry. They don't want to go forward, they don't want to go public for fear that they could be blacklisted by the halal certifiers or they could be charged more.
Some Islamic associations have also formed companies or have registered business names for the purpose of running their halal certification as businesses. This is necessary to profit from the gains because incorporated associations are meant to be not-for-profit club or community groups. Each of these 33 separate halal certifiers have different labels, different standards, different qualifications, if they have any at all, different market accreditation, and different motives. It's very cumbersome and confusing. This is by no means a complete list, and some may no longer be certifying at the time of publication. They provide similar services, yet some are charities and some are private businesses. Australia has approximately 500,000 Muslims, which is around 2.2% of the population, and 33 known halal certifying bodies. Indonesia has 210 million Muslims, which is about 84% of their population, and only 1 halal certifying body, as does Malaysia and all other Islamic countries for that matter, and all are government bodies. Our Islamic trading partners all have just one government-run, government-regulated halal body. Australia's halal industry is an unregulated mess.
Halal certification is not a charity in any way, shape or form. A charitable organisation may run a halal certification company and get the benefit of being a charity. Quite clearly it is a business. Halal certification isn't a charity.
Oh, it's clearly a business. There's no charity about it. One of the certifiers, which is that crooked organisation called Muslims Australia, or AFIC, when we held them up to account for their financial accounts, it couldn't justify or legitimise any of it. They say that it's a not-for-profit service, and yet they were profiteering extraordinarily from it, not paying any tax, and then those funds were being used to support or indulge the demands of a few. And AFIC have since been proven, I thought at the time, that they have misused taxpayers' money. It is riddled with corruption, and yet they're out there claiming the moral high ground for halal certification.
It's been clearly shown that the main purpose of halal certification is to raise money for mosques, Islamic schools, Islamic charities and other Islamic organisations. Australians opposed to halal certification are not bigots. They simply want to enjoy the tolerance and freedoms supposedly available to everyone in our democracy. I do not want Islamic religious practices imposed upon me, and I do not want to fund them. That is my democratic right in a free and tolerant society.